This morning, friends, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the call series, which is loosely based on Adam Hamilton's book of the same name. This book was birthed from a teaching series that Pastor Hamilton shared with his church, the Church of the Resurrection, a tiny little church in Kansas City with some 20,000 members, averaging 10,000 in worship on Sunday morning. Now, it is the largest and fastest growing church in American Methodism, and for all I know, world Methodism. But other than that, their church is the same as this one. It's filled with good, faithful souls who try to follow Jesus as closely as we know how to, and some who aren't exactly sure what that means. And maybe that's you this morning. Now, I don't know about you, but there have been a number of times in my life where I've wondered, what is it that God really wants from me? And sooner or later, the word call pops up in that conversation. I mean, how many times in our faith experiences have we heard about everyone having a call on their lives? And we've heard that word used in so many ways, with so many meanings, that it's become church speak, that can and often does mean just about anything to some. But since the very earliest days of Christianity, the church insists that everyone does have a call. And I completely agree. Everyone does have a call, depending on what you understand call to mean. I've heard it defined as being contact. Like God calls you or texts you and says, hey, Pat, what's up? This is God. I'm just calling to check in, see what's happening. You doing okay? Well, I've never had one of those phone calls. Never had one of those phone calls. Or we sometimes think of it as a first contact kind of thing. In other words, our faith starts from that first contact with God. Like everything else we've done with our faith to that point, well, it really hasn't meant very much. And sometimes we consider the call in a military context, like, well, we've been drafted. Like God says, you're a Christian now, mister, and you're going to China for 20 years, and you have no choice if you love Jesus. Oh, and you're leaving tomorrow. I've never heard that one either. And of course, there are all kinds of other meanings in between this. So depending on which one of those you understand the word to mean or are afraid that it does mean, we really want to be clear about what God's expectations for us are, right? Well, that's what we'll be spending a few minutes talking about this morning. But before we move on into that, let's take a moment to be in prayer together. Gracious and loving God, we're so grateful for this opportunity to be in this place with you this morning. It's going to be a big morning. But we know if we're to understand, if we're to get the message that you have in store for us, well, we have to be open to it. And if we're going to be open to it, really open to it, we need your involvement with us. We need you to send the Holy Spirit with a spirit of openness this morning, to open our minds, our ears, and our hearts to what we're going to hear. And we pray especially for the determination to not only hear, but to do something with what we hear this morning. Amen. Now, personally, it is interesting to me that Adam Hamilton used Brother Paul as the model for what a Christian call might look like. I mean, instead of the more easy to get along with Apostle Peter, for instance. Let's be clear, Paul is not the poster boy for getting along with other people. Having an obedient faith, absolutely and certainly. But as for the sweet passive, turn the other cheek images that the world has stuck upon Christians, no, that's not Paul. That is not Paul. And he has many, many ancient and modern critics who accuse him of everything from distorting the gospel to being an apostate Jew, being hard to get along with, as Peter and James and other leaders of the early church certainly could bear witness to. More modern scholars accuse him of being pro-slavery, of being anti-gay, and there are many, many modern women who do not have him on their must-read list at all. In fact, my wife, when she hits the pearly gates, she says she wants to see Paul first. And I suggest to her, honey, if you want in, maybe that's not a good idea. But on the positive side of the ledger, Paul had a profound impact on the Christian movement, and we cannot deny that. His missionary journeys that we've been reviewing took the gospel across the entire Roman world. He was church planter. He was mentor for many second-generation Christian leaders, providing guidance in person and through his writings. So friends, maybe it's Paul's very imperfections and humanity that made him such a valuable example to Adam Hamilton and to us for how to understand the call. Paul would have understood some things about the call differently than the modern church does, by the way, and that shouldn't come as a surprise. See, as an educated person, when the word call was mentioned, Paul would have known that it was frequently linked with the Greek root word kaneo, most generally meant simply as an invitation. So when we read the word call in the New Testament, we need to understand that what we should hear is an invitation to be in relationship with God. It really is about God just wanting a relationship with us. No tricks, no loopholes, no fine print, no strong arm or guilt involved. That's what we do. That's what we do. Our call is God inviting us to walk with him in the garden again. And then share what we receive. That's it. Now, I could end the sermon right there, but I'm not going to. Modern Christians often understand the call as our to-do list or our faith job. But in fact, understanding the gifts we have to contribute to the bringing into the kingdom is most generally a maturing process involving trial and error and not the first step. Remember, Paul first became a persecutor of early Christians before he became a missionary to the Gentiles. Now, there's no doubt that we have been gifted. Every person in this room, you have been gifted to make a difference. But looking at the life of faith-filled service as a sentence at hard labor comes from the church and our culture. It doesn't come from God. Honestly, too often, the church has used call to mean something we want done. So sometimes when pastors talk about all of us having a call, we don't hear that invitation that is inherent in that word. What we hear is we need help in the nursery. Or you're not doing enough. We feel guilt or annoyance, but we don't feel the invitation that should be there. I hope you never hear that from us. If you do, please come in and talk with Pastor Alyssa and myself. But friends, the truth is the church is not just a way to reach out to the world. It's a co-op, isn't it? A group of people with a shared purpose of faith. Any group of people needs to share in child care and maintenance and education, etc. But this is a shared duty and not necessarily a call. Mowing my lawn, I assure you, is not my call. It's just something that I have to do every week. Now, such things might be a call. If, say, we have gifts for fixing things. I have gifts for breaking things, but not fixing things. And we realize that our pitching in can save us, that is the church, money to use elsewhere, and it makes the building more comfortable or safer for our family of faith. The same with working with our senior citizens or our children or our shut-ins. There are times when it's just what people who care do because it needs done. But sometimes we realize that when we do these things, it makes us feel important. It makes us feel fulfilled and like we're making the world a better place for a certain group of people. And we realize this just might be what we're invited to do. Friends, we will continue to invite you into a relationship with Jesus Christ. But if you're living in a relationship with God already, you know that you walk where He walks. You see, what He sees, and you feel your heart beginning to break with the things that break His mighty heart. Things like poverty and violence, needless human suffering, greed, destruction of creation, and much, much more. Any action on our part comes from the example of God's love that we see and feel through our closeness with God. Paul understood this. He knew that his call was first and simply an invitation to walk with God, and what he did after that was his reaction to this relationship. Now, another thing Paul understood that we sometimes struggle with is not waiting until we're perfect before we roll up our sleeves and make a difference. Paul was church planter extraordinaire. No one in the history of the church has ever been as effective as Paul at what he did. But he also understood that his confrontational spirit often caused unnecessary trouble for him and the fledgling church. Romans 7:15 says, I don't understand what I do. For what I want to do, I don't do that. What I hate to do, that's what I do. That's what I do. So the truth is, friends, like Paul, you and I, we're just imperfect people learning what living in a relationship with God can or should look like. Though I didn't know it then, I learned an awful lot about that. Especially Paul's extremely focused practice. I learned a lot about that from my grandfather, Charlie, growing up on a farm in West Virginia. And many's the night I've seen him eat dinner at dark with us and then go back to the shed to finish the project. That might take him the bulk of the rest of the night, and he was well into his 70s. Tired or sick or aching made no difference. I never saw him take a day off or a shortcut, not ever. He never did good enough work. Not one time did I ever see that in my granddad's witness. So when I read Paul's letters, I read a master teaching beginners the ropes of living with their call. And I hear my grandfather's voice say, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing to the very best of your abilities. Don't take shortcuts. Don't do good enough work. Boy, do I hear that echoing in my mind from my granddad. Don't dishonor yourself for the one who sent you by doing less than your very best efforts. A portion of our text for this morning says how faithful Paul was to his relationship with God. I've worked much harder. I've been jailed more often, beaten up more times than I can count, and at death door time after time. I've been flogged 5 times with the Jews, 39 lashes, and remember, to the Jews, 40 lashes was a death sentence. Beaten by Roman rods 3 times. Pummeled with rocks once. I've been shipwrecked 3 times, immersed in the open sea for a night and a day. In hard traveling year in and year out, I've had to ford rivers and fend off robbers, struggle with friends, struggle with foes. I've been at risk in the city, at risk in the country, endangered by desert sun and sea storm, and betrayed by those I thought were my brothers. I've known drudgery and hard labor, many a long and lonely night without sleep, many a missed meal, blasted by cold, naked to the weather. Without doubt, Paul was an incredibly tough and courageous man. But that's not what he's talking about in this text. And he's not bragging either. He shares that he doesn't take the easy way out, and he could have. He didn't back down because what he did had eternal consequences for those who were paying attention to what he did. And they deserved his very best work, and he knew that he had to bear up under these conditions like those he served so that they would know that he was one of them. And not the newcomers who just wanted the glory but couldn't and wouldn't pay the price for it. But Paul wasn't the only one in history who thought like this. In the outset of World War II, German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer was studying in the United States. He told his friends he needed to go home at the outbreak of the war because the German church and his country would need him. He was warned that the SS was rounding up and imprisoning all the clergy who would not sign a pact with the Nazis. He flew to England, where he was again cautioned to stay until the war was over, and then go home and help them rebuild after the war was over. And he said he couldn't stay out of Germany, because if he did, they would see him as an outsider who stayed safe until the danger had passed. So he went back to Germany and was imprisoned for speaking out against the Nazis and was executed in early April 1945. Martin Luther King had a dream. He had a dream of a world where African American children and white children could play and study and live together in peace. Weren't we all Americans? As a Christian leader, he thought it was time we realized how divided America was being limited by prejudice and hatred. It was time for change. And in the beginning of his peaceful demonstrations, he was warned that they would not stay peaceful. And he said, but darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. He said, hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. So he was jailed and he was beaten and still in march. He had death threats against him and his family, and he continued to march. His backers begged him to stay off the front lines because it was getting dangerous, but he would not. He refused, saying he would not cower while others were beaten and jailed in his place, not to call himself a leader. With God's help and men and women of good faith beside him, he would not let fear of punishment stop him short of the goal. On April 4th, 1968, he was shot by a sniper on the balcony of his hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. Many others have walked in the footsteps of Paul, accepting their human imperfections but refusing to be limited by them. They also accepted their call as an invitation to a relationship with God. But they also understood that if they really accept that invitation, then they walk with him towards the darkness and not away from it. And not because they're guilted into it, not because they're ordered forward. They just accepted the invitation, and drawn by love, they walked where God walked. So what does God expect from us? What are we really doing here this morning, church? Do you know? Are you sure? What do things like church and faith and call really mean? And what's it all about? Paul knew the answer. So did Bonhoeffer, King, Rosa Parks, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, my grandfather Charlie, and lots of you. They knew the answer. When we get past all the rules and regulations and lines in the sand and walls that separate, we get to the answer. It's like a song that echoes through the halls of heaven and the chambers of the human heart. Every newborn child knows it instinctively and leans towards the warmth of it. Every adult human being feels it and must decide what to do with it. The song is a whisper. The song is a prayer. I just want someone to look. Isn't that the cry of all humanity? I just want someone to come alongside me when my strength is gone. Will you do that? And when I cannot see through the darkness, will you be my eyes today? When I'm dying in my doubt, will you be my faith? Our answer to what does God want from us lies in our call, which is an open invitation to come and be loved without limit, without precondition or contest, and then to share that love with others however we share love best and with the greatest joy. So again, church, what are we doing here this morning? What's it all about? I think Paul would say it's about relationships, Christian. Because when all the fog lifts and the confusion is cleared away, when the mountains fall and the oceans dry up in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, also known as the love chapter, Paul says we'll be left with three things: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. You get it. Now go live it.